Welcome to Thai Terrors, a series where I'm going to be taking a look at horror films from Thailand, which to me has always been a country that seemed pretty underrepresented when it comes to talk about foreign films. Now, I'm no expert on the subject whatsoever. I can't claim to be anything but just an enthusiastic neophyte, but the reason I'm doing this is because pretty much every time that I watch a horror film from Thailand, I'm just really consistently impressed by just how good they are. So this is just sort of my attempt to share some of that love with you that I have developed for a country that I reckon can boast some of the coolest and most imaginative horror films of recent years. So today, we're going to be kicking things off with a film from 2007 by the name of Sick Nurses, which is one of those horror films that falls into that awesome category of horror films set in hospitals. Think the likes of your Halloween 2 or your Hellraiser 2, and it's just such a gloriously, unapologetically wild ride of a film. It opens up with this caption that explains to us that a spirit will return to life to haunt the people that it loved after 7 days. We then see a body being stripped and prepared by this team of young female nurses. The story here is that the body is being sold for its parts. The hospital that the nurses work at houses this black market organ trafficking operation. A deal is arranged for the parts, but the body will have to stay at the hospital for, of course, 7 days until it can be collected. So, as the rest of the film unfolds, each of the nurses are haunted by the spirit of the dead woman, who kind of manifests itself in what I suppose you could say is your kind of fairly typical sort of long-haired, ring-inspired spectre, where they're subjected to this series of twisted, reality-bending nightmares, where they're basically going to be made to pay for what they've done. So there's a lot of things that I really like about Sick Nurses. First off, it's got a load of energy and style to it, which is something that really clicks with me. Admittedly, it is a very simple and straightforward plot. It's basically just a series of supernatural poetic justice vignettes, but it's all about the way that the story is told. It's got this really big, bold, simple, high-energy visual style to it that really opens up in the awesome fantasy sequences to really twist things and turn them on their head in a way that's never dull. There's a lot of cool, clever shots and ideas in this that suggest that the directors, this is a film with 2 directors, but sadly I'm not even going to try and pronounce their names, but they're both really cool, that they're really having a blast making this film. The basic idea is sort of like a 7 Deadly Sins thing, where we're introduced to each of the nurses as they're finishing up their shift, and then as they separate to go off, they're then picked off by the malevolent spectre one by one. We get little sequences showing their personal foibles and peculiarities, which sort of roughly conform to the 7 Deadly Sins type idea. We've got greed, pride, jealousy, gluttony, lust, and so on. And so the sin that each of the nurses kind of best exemplifies will then go on to sort of suggest the means in which they're eventually made to suffer by the omnipotent spectre of the dead woman. This is cool because it lets you appreciate the setup and planning of each of the sequences, which is then paid off, instead of just being this series of straightforward random kills. But just like you get with stuff like your Nightmare on Elm Street or Saw, for example, where there's always that kind of element of poetic justice, the characterizations of each of the nurses here comes out as we see their fears and what it is that makes them tick. And that means that there's no flab in the storytelling, because even seemingly random scenes of the nurses just fannying about are all busily setting up the means of their eventual demise, which I think is really cool. In fact, there's actually more to it than just your straightforward supernatural slasher. Without getting into spoilers, there's the suggestion that, sort of in the way that certain scenes are filmed when we get a different character's perspective on what's happening, which is why so many of the scenes are the characters just on their own rather than together, that a lot of what's plaguing the nurses, a lot of the twisted kind of psychological manifestations of their own worst fears, are in actual fact conjured up by their own minds and their own sense of guilt. Although, if you think that does seem a bit lame, I can promise you that this is not a film that cheats on the supernatural horror. It totally obeys its own internal code of logic, whilst also feeling just gloriously unburdened by the need to take place in anything like the real world as we know it. But even though the fantasy death set pieces are crazy and wildly gory and imaginative, there is a bit of a feeling that the kind of cumulative effect of just seeing all these scenes of supernatural torture and suffering do get maybe a little bit deadening. That you start to worry that it's not necessarily going to amount to more than just being the sum of its parts. I mean, the evil charcoal-skinned ghost that appears to playfully torment the nurses in the most gruesome ways possible does sort of begin to feel so powerful and dangerous that there just doesn't seem to be any way set up for sick nurses to come to any kind of a climax other than they all get killed one by one and justice is done. It seems to be less about revenge or bad people being made to pay for their evil deeds, but more about just watching the nurses suffer. There's definitely moments that will remind you that this was a film that was being made at the height of the Saw franchise, with some very twisted and imaginative death scenes. But as things move on, we eventually start getting flashbacks that kind of explain and elaborate on events just a little bit more. They kind of set up the possibility of redemption for one or more of the characters, and begin to give you hints that there's something more going on to this than what you think. It carefully sets up what's got to be one of the most audacious and shocking finales that I've seen in a long time, that doesn't just pull some crazy shit out of nowhere, but actually develops from things that we've only seen in small flashes and seemingly inconsequential little details. It's also, I should say, an ending that brings with it a kind of emotional poignancy that you really wouldn't expect from the sort of film that this appears to be. Whilst it does dwell quite a bit on the one-by-one supernatural revenge scenes and feels pretty episodic for a whole chunk in the middle, Sick Nurses definitely delivers this really solid ending that's totally fitting for a film that's this unapologetically batshit insane. And if you think Sleepaway Camp's got a shocking ending, wait until you see Sick Nurses. It's a whole new dimension of holy shit, and I love it. I guess though that one of the biggest complaints that you could have about this film going in is thinking that it's just going to be mindless sleaze, that it's just about this group of improbably sexy young nurses getting killed off in gory and inventive ways. Well, in actual fact, it's a film that manages to be sexy whilst not being gratuitous about it. It's a film, in fact, that's so ungratuitous that there's actually a shower scene that takes place where one of the nurses doesn't even take off her clothes. Because, I mean, come on, that would just be tacky. But all in all, I think that Sick Nurses is a great little Thai horror film. The kind of simple but well put together B-movie that's got more of that genuine fun and enthusiasm for getting a chance to make something that's just this gloriously violent and unhinged that you actually got in real 80s films than any of the throwbacks that get made these days that think that the 80s is just about drum machines, synth music and loud obnoxious cliches. Because when you get right down to it, it's really that feeling of reckless, energetic mayhem that makes this one just so much fun to watch. And maybe it's that feeling of just this emerging love of genre stuff. I mean, Thai horror cinema is still young enough to have that boisterous swagger to it. And that feeling of getting to play with mad ideas and images and to make something that you couldn't make in any other genre of filmmaking that's really just so infectious. Sick Nurses is a real blast, and I'd say is also a pretty good jumping on point if you haven't seen a lot of Thai horror films. It's very simple and accessible, but it's also got a great, bold, confident vibe to it. This intense, bloody atmosphere that always promises there's going to be more great gore and nightmarish ideas around the corner, and some plot twists and ideas that are just so outrageous that you can't help but just be impressed at how much it goes all in on the craziness. It's lean and sexy and imaginative as hell, and I'm going to say that in my books, Sick Nurses gets an 8 out of 10. I really loved it, and I definitely recommend that you give it a shot.